The world is doomed. Those called the 10 strongest knights who protected the continent had already exhausted all their energy. And over this vast contaminated land, only death prevailed over all. Except for him, the knight who was still alive. All of this was caused by the demon commander of Gluttony, who admitted that this human was strong, but that it still wasn't enough to kill him. Even so, our warrior grabbed his hammer and struck the commander's arm with such force that he crushed it, smashing him from head to toe, because that monster was just noisy. And in this way, a little peace was finally achieved, though due to his injuries, he wouldn't last much longer either. Then he paused to think. Had he done everything wrong from the start? After all, mana training was knowledge exclusive to knights and nobles. Therefore, he had to overcome countless failures, climbing to the top even while being at rock bottom. What if, instead of what happened, he could have trained with the proper methods from the beginning? Could he have saved the continent and the entire world? But reflecting on the commander of Gluttony, he thought that despite everything, he was really exceptional, even though he was only the 7th among all the Demon King's commanders. It was at that moment that he heard a voice calling him. The one calling was the Emperor of the Sword, Asgard von Valentia, saying that he would die soon. But before that, he wanted to ask a question. Why didn't Tiny flee the battle, since he lived in the slums and had nothing to protect? Tiny replied that fleeing a battle was shameful, for a man must always be confident. Upon hearing this, the old man burst into laughter, saying that Tiny should trust in the talent that made him one of the 10 strongest knights, solely through his pride. And then he began to speak strange things, as if leaving a message. He said that when he returned, Tiny should find him, but not immediately, because otherwise even he wouldn't believe it. The Emperor then revealed a family secret. His daughter's birth name was Leela, a tribute to the flower he and his wife liked. However, he admitted that, in truth, he didn't actually like that flower so much. He asked that Tiny not forget this information, as it would be a code only he should know. And with that, the Emperor's consciousness faded. At the same time, Tiny woke up in a familiar room, thinking that everything had been just a dream. But in fact, he was reliving a terrible past, where invaders took his sister, who died taking care of him. She had been beaten while trying to protect Tiny, who was hiding a ring. At that moment, Wolf's men arrived, angrily kicking the door. Tiny, with his frail body, could barely move, and his sister was brutally attacked. One of the men, while kicking her, remarked that corpses had value, as there were people who liked to play with them, and that brought in good money. Tiny, unable to move his arms, desperately wanted to protect his sister, at least this time. Then, with all his effort, a blue energy surged from his hand, and he managed to move. In one leap, he threw himself at one of the attackers, determined not to let them take his sister. The men began beating him, but Tiny resisted, and after several blows to the head, the bandits said something had changed. This was the end of his nightmare, but this time, he had managed to act differently. The mana had awakened in him earlier than it should have. He realized that perhaps the Sword Emperor's words were right. This wasn't a dream. He had really returned to the past and could now change the future of the world. Taking advantage of the moment, he cursed the old man for not sending him even further back in time. However, at that instant, Tiny began coughing up blood, a consequence of his frail body trying to use mana. Even so, he knew that complaining was useless. If the Emperor had sent him to the past, this was his chance to ensure that his sister could rest in peace, something he hadn't been able to do in his previous life. With that in mind, Tiny decided to follow his path and avenge his sister's death. But before that, he needed to ensure she rested in peace. And even though they didn't share the same blood, what they had in common were their black eyes and hair, something rare throughout the continent. Because of this, many people avoided him, but his sister, always kind, gave him the name Tiny and treated him with love. That's why, this time, he was able to bury his sister in peace. Meanwhile, one of the women, Emma, a friend of his sister's, thought that Tiny had changed a bit. Not long ago, she had found him eating soup in front of his sister's body, his wounds already healed. When he finished eating, he simply picked her up in his arms and thanked Emma for the soup, promising to return the favor one day. After that, his sister's funeral began, and Tiny remembered the words she always said: "Be confident and keep your head held high." For that reason, he would have no regrets in this life. 1 month later, it was finally time for revenge. He arrived before the wrongdoers and asked where Wolf was. One of the henchmen tried to slap him, but Tiny caught his hand with a single motion and twisted the man's arm. Another came at him, grabbing him by the shirt, but couldn't do anything. Tiny, with ease, delivered a powerful kick to the man, for his mana-infused body was already at an advanced stage, something he had not been able to achieve in his previous life. The perfect fusion between the physical body and mana. As a result, his body had become much stronger. However, this powerful technique came with a side effect. You need to eat like a boar, or better yet, like Luffy. Emma even complained that Tiny had eaten her entire 10-day supply. She soon realized that after reconstructing his body, something had changed. Now that his mana had awakened, Tiny could fix the weaknesses from when his body was frail. Then he grabbed another thug by the leg, swung him into the air, and threw him far away, thanking them for having broken his body before. The man flew so far that he destroyed the entrance to the place. Now, Tiny was determined to finish off everyone there. The other criminals mocked him, asking what a kid would do without a weapon. Tiny then pulled at one of the fallen men's legs, saying he had just found one. He started using the man's body as a weapon, whipping one against the other, defeating everyone on the lower level. Next, Tiny called the Raider brothers, who were upstairs, to come down and fight him. Before jumping down, one of them remarked that Tiny was a mana user and that a body
body like that should be worth a fortune. Then they leaped toward him. While messing with the broken body of one of the men, Tiny remembered his situation from the past when an old man was shocked to see him use a person as a weapon, commenting that he had no class. For that reason, this same old man taught him hand-to-hand combat. When the thugs arrived, Tiny easily dodged and punched the first one in the face. The second, who came to play, took a shin kick. Tiny jumped on him, threw him to the ground, and finished him off with a kick, like those combos from Dragon Ball. Meanwhile, the invaders' leader, Wolf, asked who was there. Tiny recalled that in his past life, he had discovered that Wolf was a pimp belonging to the Beastmen tribe. Even among them, the silver werewolf he transformed into was even more special, as it indicated the direct manifestation of the Beastmen royal family's bloodline. In the past life, killing him had been a huge challenge. But this time, Tiny arrived calmly, asking if Wolf was already shitting himself in fear. Enraged, Wolf began to transform, determined to finish the boy. When he finally transformed, Tiny noticed something was off. He didn't have the silver fur. So Tiny asked what kind of mutt was standing before him. Even so, Wolf charged at him, but Tiny easily dodged, finding him slow compared to what he had jaw and using mana. Broke it with a snap. He recalled when a Beastman friend had told him that this was how to deal with their kind. Wolf kept attacking, but Tiny dodged everything with ease. To him, Wolf was nothing more than a barking dog that didn't bite. And that's when the beating session began. His friend had said that when it came to Beastmen, you just had to keep hitting them until they got tired, as they could regenerate from almost anything. So Tiny decided to enjoy himself beating the little wolf. Tiny delivered a kick so strong that it forced the guy to fully de-transform, sending him flying into a wall. Now he wasn't just going to break his spine. After all the massacre, Tiny stood there thinking that perhaps this would bring some comfort to his sister's soul, as if it were up to him, Wolf's head would already be rolling on the ground. However, now that he was all beaten up, begging for Lady Irina's forgiveness. Meanwhile, Tiny simply asked what Beastman like Wolf was doing there. Amidst the chaos, Tiny ended up finding a strange stone on the ground. When he picked it up, he immediately sensed demonic ki, as there was a white wolf chained inside the stone. Seeing this, Tiny recalled a long time ago in the Elven Forest when an elf spoke about spiritual creatures. She explained that these creatures are reborn after accumulating mana for at least 100 years. What she described as the quintessence of a spirit was exactly what Tiny was holding, a spirit stone. He wondered why Wolf had one of these stones, especially in such a strange state. Even so, Tiny punched the chains, freeing the white wolf as he watched its memories. This spirit had been surrounded by a group of strangers using demonic ki, trapping it inside the stone. The boy receiving the stone was Wolf himself. These scumbags had been creating beastmen by having people absorb spirit stones, and that's how that boy had transformed into Wolf. This time, since Tiny had arrived early, Wolf hadn't been able to absorb the stone. However, the white wolf, furious, tried to bite Wolf. Tiny stopped it, saying that this scum deserved something far worse than death. The wolf seemed to understand, and Tiny remembered what that woman had said. It was possible for humans to tame a spirit, provided they had a pure soul and enough mana. That's why usually only children were able to do it. Tiny became pensive. After all, even though he was young, his soul was far from pure. But since it was working, he had no complaints. He was able to communicate with the wolf through the mana flowing inside the spirit stone. Thus, Tiny decided to form a contract with the wolf. Unlike magic, it wasn't necessary to focus on raising the spirit's level, as most of these beasts grew stronger as their tamer's strength increased. That's why the elf arena was among the top 10 knights in the world. Before accepting the contract, the wolf asked Tiny for a favor, to avenge his capture by the cult worshippers who did this to him. In this way, Tiny obtained his first spirit, naming it Moon Wolf. Looking at Wolf collapse on the floor, Tiny concluded that it was all the work of those worshippers who rejected God and worshipped demons. With that, he kicked Wolf, telling him to wake up. When nothing happened, Moon Wolf went to do his job. Tiny then asked where the guy who gave Wolf that spirit stone was. Terrified, Wolf said the organization would kill him. But before he could reveal anything, his head exploded due to a spell that prevented him from saying a word. With that, Tiny focused on what was most important. He took Wolf's body and threw it against the wall, where he knew the scoundrel's treasure was hidden. The item he needed was the Valentia family ring. Some time ago, a blonde-haired girl had asked for his name and given him a ring, telling him that whenever he needed help, he could show the ring to find her. That same ring had been stolen by those wrongdoers. The person who had given it to Tiny was Clovan Valentia, the youngest daughter of the Sword Emperor, known for her kindness and called the Saint of Valentia. This had happened because in the Valentia family culture, children who came of age had to place flowers in each temple and make their names known. That's how Clove had met Tiny on the streets and given him the ring. In his past life, Tiny took too long to seek revenge, and thus it took him longer to recover the ring. Now, with the ring in hand, he saw a great opportunity to find the Sword Emperor. Suddenly, Tiny heard a voice from below. He went down, knowing that the time had come. The shiny, bald knight had arrived. He couldn't believe that a mere child had caused all that destruction. This was Lamb, the commander commander of the castle guards, who was already thinking of using the situation as an excuse to increase the bribe he received in exchange for protection. But before Lamb could do anything, Tiny descended the stairs saying he was just dealing with some trash. And since there was a knight around, it was obvious he had been getting good money from Wolf. The bald guy immediately flexed his veins even where he had no hair and charged furiously at Tiny. However, Tiny simply struck him with his hand, throwing the bald man far away, as given the knight's level, if Tiny had given his all, he could have easily defeated him. Right after, Tiny delivered a knee strike, and even though he was strong, the bald man managed to block the blow. Now that he had shown a bit of his power, Tiny knew he needed to act smartly, as the bald knight didn't yet need to be treated as an enemy. Just as the bald man prepared to draw his sword, Moon Wolf appeared in his giant form, causing the knight to break into a cold sweat. With the situation calmer, Tiny proposed a deal. Instead of Wolf paying the bribe, Tiny would make the payment himself. The bald man, impressed, replied, "Oh ho, you're clever, kid," and asked if Tiny would pay the 5 gold coins Wolf used to pay. Tiny, however, knew that the bald man received no more than 1 gold coin and offered to pay him 1.5. If the knight didn't accept the offer, Tiny was ready to end the negotiations and start a fight. Of course, the bald man backed down and agreed, stating that the last day of the month would be the due date. As he left, the men who had called Lamb questioned him, "Mr. Lamb, are you going to betray us?" To which he replied, "Money speaks for me, friend." At that moment, Tiny tossed a coin to Lamb and said that since the owner had changed, he should set a time to greet the new lord of the estate. Even though Lamb had left the scene, it was clear that there would be no more paydays for him. As for the 3 defeated thugs, Tiny gave them a mission: gather all the residents of the place. If anyone tried to escape, Moon Wolf would have a good meal. And so the 3 big men ran off. If everything went according to plan, taking care of that place wouldn't take more than a week. An hour later, the 3 had brought everyone together. As soon as she arrived, Emma ran, thinking someone had beaten Tiny again. In reality, the blood on his hands was Wolf's, who was already lying dead nearby. The crowd panicked, thinking they wouldn't escape punishment. Everyone knew that the estate lord was behind Wolf. Then, with firmness, Tiny declared, "Challenging the nobility is a grave sin, and that's why the estate lord is going down too." Cut to the guards, commenting that they hadn't seen Sir Lamb in days. In fact, he was on probation, as there had been an incident involving crazed lunatics claiming they were chased by a giant wolf. In that episode, their leader was so disfigured that they couldn't even recognize him. Moreover, all the money had disappeared. Even so, the guards didn't understand what Lamb had to do with it. The problem, however, was that Lamb's negotiation with the new boss hadn't gone well. All the shops and businesses in the city were closed, and the estate lord was furious, calling the leader to resolve the situation. Tiny, remembering his past life, knew that even after examining the account books, nothing suspicious had been noticed at the time. At the lord's request, he handed over the book and half of the fortune. But now things would be different, as Tiny had understood that there were nobles who crushed other nobles. And it was precisely because of that account book that the estate lord was in trouble. With that, Tiny declared to the people, "Now you're free. If you want to get revenge or vent, this is your last chance to take a few hits on the guy." The women couldn't resist and all went to kick the headless leader. Additionally, he allowed everyone to take as much money as they wanted from Wolf's treasure to flee. Before they left, Tiny made it clear, "If you dare commit crimes for money or reveal what happened here, our friend Wolf will tear you apart piece by piece." He then asked Emma to leave the estate and go to Diane with the others, as Tiny still had another place to go. And so Tiny thanked everyone, declaring that from that day on, the red light district of Invader was closed. Meanwhile, the guards discussed the arrival of the new leader, whose name was Tiny. When he appeared, they were perplexed and asked, "What's a child doing here?" Tiny then summoned the big wolf, causing the guards to fall back in fear. After all, with his child-sized body, things like this would keep happening. Further ahead, the Grand Master of the Knight's Order, Cran, introduced himself. However, Tiny, in his defiant manner, remarked that it seemed to be their custom to leave a guest waiting for so long. The knight, offended, was already preparing to draw his sword, telling Tiny to know his place. But it was Cran who needed to learn his place, as he tried to appear superior, though he was insignificant because Tiny was a guest of the lord of the estate. Cran, furious, started to speak more, but Tiny interrupted, saying that the real bad smell in the room came from him. As the knight advanced with his sword, the butler appeared, informing them that the lord was waiting. So the almost bald Cran began to guide Tiny inside the castle. Once there, Tiny was astonished and commented that it was a pleasure to meet the lord. The man before him was Timon von Filias, a baron. Tiny was surprised because in the future, he remembered Timon as someone 3 or 4 times larger. However, he knew that the account book would bring down the baron quickly. Tiny then expressed his desire to become the lord's weapon, putting the knight leader, Cran, as his competitor. The people present were even more shocked to learn that Tiny was only 13 years old. The lord stood up and commented, "So the boy who stole my wallet wants to become my weapon." But Tiny replied, saying that he believed he was doing the lord a favor. Meanwhile, the defiant Cran asked for permission to execute Tiny right there. However, Tiny mentioned the crackdown on drugs that the Duke of Valentia was carrying out in his territory, along with the fact that the Princess of Valentia had recently visited the state. He suggested that Cran think twice before everything blew up. Cran tried to belittle Tiny's words, but the lord interrupted him, saying that if what the boy said was true, he deserved a reward. The lord also heard rumors that Tiny explanation. Tiny then glanced around with the help of the Moon Wolf and revealed that Cran was using a magic magic circle belonging to a dark mage. If Cran could use 2 of these circles, it meant he had offered hundreds of bodies or live sacrifices. This explained why there was so much talk about buying corpses for a high price. Without waiting for more answers from Tiny, Cran drew his sword to attack him. However, Tiny's spirit had already transformed into the powerful Mega Moon Wolf. The Lord, observing the situation, decided to change the terms of the test and asked Cran about the boy's power level. According to Cran, Tiny was close to stage 2, and unless he was descended from a prestigious family, he would be considered a prodigy. His mana pattern was perfectly stable. Tiny then improvised, saying that he had learned all of this in a vision, but he knew he needed a better excuse to convince the Lord and the knights, so he claimed that he had learned everything from his deceased parents before coming to Felia's. And if anyone wanted to confirm this story, it would be impossible, as Felia's accepted all kinds of refugees, making it difficult to uncover information about his true identity. In the end, the Lord decided to trust his word, as he would judge the truth later. Meanwhile, Tiny was invited to stay at the Lord's residence, since things had been going wrong since he killed Wolf, and the Lord needed an excuse to cover up the events. The question left in the air was, an excuse for whom? Perhaps for the same organization Wolf was part of. If Tiny wasn't careful, he could end up in trouble. Accepting the proposal, Tiny asked if the Lord had any special visitors. The Lord agreed, saying that Tiny should be very polite to this person, but it would still take a while for them to arrive. There would be 3 days until the duchy reviewed the books, 3 more days until the punishment unit was formed, and 10 days until that unit arrived in Felia's. In total, that would be about 16 days. If the guest arrives after that, everything will be resolved. Tiny then asks the Lord when the guest will arrive, as he needs to learn etiquette before the visit. The Lord replies that the guest arrives in a week. Tiny panics, knowing there won't be enough time to prepare. Faced with this situation, there are only 2 options. The first would be to flee, as Tiny's allies are far away from there. However, if he fled, the Lord would probably put him on the wanted list, complicating his future meeting with the Sword Emperor. Furthermore, the idea of running away from something bothers him, because even without the necessary strength, he always finds a way to overcome his opponents. The second option is riskier. This guest seems to be someone from the high nobility. With the house empty, the fact that an important visitor is about to arrive makes everything more suspicious. The person supporting the Lord must be someone who cannot be shown to the public. If something major were to happen in Felia's, the visit could be postponed. For this reason, Tiny concludes that he needs to become stronger to defeat both the Grandmaster and the Lord, but he decides to leave that for later, as he is hungry. In the dining hall, the cook is startled to see Tiny lining up bowls and eating non-stop. His body improves every time he eats, making any medicinal herbs unnecessary. The boy just eats, and eats. At that moment, a man appears and asks if Tiny learned his manners from a dog. Tiny retorts, "That's right, if you're insulting me, bastard, you better respect me now." The man responds, "Respect someone who wants to hit a little boy? That's tough, huh?" The man gets angry, curses Tiny, and breaks the table. Another man with a scruffy beard tries to calm him down, saying that Tiny is just a child, but the vagrant next to him encourages the fight. Despite this confusion, Tiny taunts the man to come at him because he wants to show the Grandmaster just how strong he really is. Tiny starts to suspect that this might have been staged by the Lord. They go outside to fight, with the crowd gathering around. The bearded man charges, and Tiny, wasting no time, kicks his legs, making him fall. The man tries to punch Tiny, but he easily dodges and delivers another kick to his leg. The man, confused, doesn't understand how a level 1 child can be so strong. Even with his legs injured, he tries to attack again with a hammer strike. However, Tiny slides under the man's legs, jumps, and grabs his neck, turning the fight into a clack-clack game. Tiny wins the battle, leaving everyone around in shock. A knight had been defeated by a child. In Tiny's mind, he won without the help of the wolf to prove his potential. At that moment, he almost faints as he spent too much mana by using all his strength. If this had happened in his past life, he would have been in trouble, since although his body recovered quickly, his mana regeneration was very slow. Now in this life, he has complete harmony between body and mana, allowing him to train as much as he wants and become even stronger than he was in his previous life. Later, the Lord comments that the information Tiny provided about the duchy's movements was accurate. He offers Tiny a veal steak, stating that the boy has a promising future. The only downside, according to the Lord, is that there aren't any good enough masters to train a genius like him. Tiny, however, responds that he has heard that the greatest knights in history grew up on their own, and what led them to follow that path was the presence of a great lord to guide their steps. The Lord is impressed by this answer, noting that both in the Empire and in neighboring kingdoms, features like Tiny's ear shape, black hair, and eyes are extremely rare. He now understands why he never imagined that a foreigner could be so valuable. Tiny, for his part, doesn't understand much of the conversation, and according to him, someone will explain the details later. However, Tiny believes that his current strength is only possible because of the strike again. In his past life, Tiny was abandoned and lost the magic circle. He continues to reflect on this as someone informs him that a certain person is eager to meet him. After this conversation, Tiny goes to the training field, full of thoughts, but he knows he needs to focus on one thing. The Lord is in the second circle and the Grandmaster is in the second stage. Therefore, Tiny needs to reach that level within 6 days. 3 days pass and his small body is already much stronger, with movements far better than before. Perhaps the problem in his past life was his monstrous size. He realized that he only wanted to be big and strong, which caused his body connected to mana to respond to this unconsciously, breaking the harmony between body and mana by growing too much. But this time, he realizes he doesn't need to be that big. At that moment, 2 men arrive to train, but upon seeing Tiny, they quickly flee. Shortly after, the captain appears, ordering him to follow, as the Lord has given instructions to present him with a weapon. Tiny thinks it's the perfect opportunity and follows the captain to the armory, where he finds various armor and swords. However, there are no axes, his preferred weapon. He asks if he can have something like the captain's sword. The captain, full of pride, says that the Gria's sword was crafted by a renowned artisan. Tiny, taunting, responds that the sword suits him much better since it should be in the hands of someone talented. The captain bursts with anger and asks if Tiny wants to die. The clever boy challenges, if you're unhappy, how about a fight? The captain doesn't hesitate and furiously charges at Tiny. Outside, people hear Tiny yelling, "I'm sorry, Captain. I'll be more careful." He leaves the armory all bruised, carrying a strange, wrapped sword. Everyone assumes that Captain Kron hit a child, fueling rumors that he dislikes the boy, which seems to be true. Back in his room, the maids ask Tiny what happened. With a sly grin, he says the captain told them they were going to get a weapon, and that's exactly what happened. Meanwhile, the Lord asks his subordinates if the sacrifice is secure, worried that Tiny is messing up the invaders' plans. He needs to resolve this quickly because in a few days, Tiny's lineage will be confirmed. If he is not from that family, he will have to pay a terrible price. However, the Lord doesn't believe this will happen, as Tiny is highly talented and possesses knowledge that could only come from a prestigious family. Additionally, he has black hair and eyes, which the Lord sees as a confirmation of his lineage. That night, as Tiny was preparing to sleep, an alarm spell from his circle was triggered. Looking ahead, he sees Tiny appearing and slicing it in half, claiming it was punishment from the heavens. The next day, the maids are frightened by the presence of a strange dark magic energy. The knights, incredulous, comment that such a thing wouldn't be possible, but the priest who was there has already reported the energy to the parish. Glenn, one of the knights, mentions that an imperial investigation will be sent. The reason the captain's body remained in such a state even after death was that he was a dark mage whose body decays instantly upon dying. Glenn notices that the sword Tiny is carrying is the same one the captain used. Everyone is surprised because the captain hasn't appeared since the previous day. The guards start investigating and question all the servants, who confirm the same story. The captain beat up the boy. Glenn calls for Tiny. When he arrives, he tells the exact same version that everyone else had given. Glenn then questions him about the fact that they investigate Tiny acting as usual, says he really didn't see anything and that his testimony is the same as the others. Seizing the opportunity, Tiny asks what will happen to him, as the Lord had said his future was secure. Glenn simply tells him to return the next day. Tiny, on the other hand, can't recall any night like that, as he remembers having defeated all of them. The next day, Tiny receives a mercenary plate and a substantial amount of money. Glenn explained that only commoners with merchant or mercenary status could enter other provinces. According to him, staying in a decaying place like that would only waste Tiny's talents, so he advised him to go far away and strengthen himself. At that moment, Tiny understood why he hadn't seen Glenn in his past life. He had probably left before everything happened. Grateful for everything, Tiny thinks that now that the Dark Mage is dead, the Imperial family will have to act. Since the duchy didn't come to them, Tiny will have to seek them out personally. Before leaving, Glenn bids farewell, asking Tiny not to forget him, though Tiny didn't even know his name. Glenn introduces himself as Glenn Libery, but asks to be called simply Glenn. Tiny departs, thinking he left an unsolved problem in that knight's hands. Now that he has the mercenary plate, he decides to go to the guild to get a horse. However, the wolf immediately appears, ready for Tiny to ride. The wolf takes on a smaller form, as spirits tend to materialize at the size they had in life, but can adjust to the sorcerer's proportions. When he mounts the wolf, Tiny feels his soul and senses merging with the animal. With everything ready, they set off, with new adventures awaiting beyond the forest. Tiny decides to head to Karun quickly, as it's where the first catastrophe will occur. In his past life, many catastrophes arose one after another, weakening humanity's power. It all began with the disappearance of Karun's relic, and Tiny needs to prevent that from happening. The relics of humanity were granted by the goddess, known as the 7 Sacred Relics. The problem is that these relics will be stolen, but this time Tiny will not allow that to happen. He plans to join the army in battle, as the first catastrophe will occur in the Sea Kingdom of Karun. Before that, however, he decides to visit the Duke's house. Meanwhile, in the city at night, a strange figure arrives, putting everyone to sleep and using magic to question Glenn about what he knew regarding the Lord's death. Glenn shares what he knows, and the man puts him back to sleep. When Glenn awakens, one of the guards reports that the Lord's body has disappeared, complicating the investigation even further. The hooded man finds the body of the sword's owner and concludes that the culprit of the incident must be that boy who defeated the wolf and vanished. He swears vengeance against Tiny for disrupting the organization's plans. At the western gate of Valencia, Tiny's plan seems to be going well, except for the fact that they still don't have enough money to buy decent equipment. At that moment, a skinny man and a fat one show up, demanding that Tiny hand over all his money. Seeing this, Tiny asks them the same question, realizing he has found his problem solvers. He remembers a rule from his past life: if a large shadow appears in an alley, it's best to hide without breathing. Tiny always caught these alley guys and shook them down mercilessly. He quickly defeats the two thieves and takes their money. Soon after, more people arrive, claiming to be from the Rufos family. Tiny, however, has never heard of them and considers them too weak. One of the men tries to attack him but gets slapped in the face. The skinny man receives a solid kick to the head, showing that this group was no match for him. Plus, Tiny walks away with a good amount of money. After that, Tiny goes to an equipment shop and buys a leather armor and a club to strike his opponents in the head. As he leaves the store, he sees a crowd talking about an important person being in the city. Curious, he asks the vendor what's going on. The vendor reveals that the Princess of Valencia is patrolling the sister taught him about affection. Chloe was the first person to give him hope. Even though the story between them didn't end on the best terms, it was thanks to the hope she gave him that he was able to keep going. These two people ended up changing his life. Tiny recalls that when he met the woman in his past life, she burst into laughter because the name Tiny didn't suit the giant man he had become. But in this life, he will meet her much sooner and secure a meeting with the Sword Emperor. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, the eldest son of Count Lucent was showing the city to Chloe, discussing trade and everything else. However, Chloe interrupts, saying she wants to see the poorer parts of the city. The young man, not understanding why, agrees to take her. Chloe's interest in these areas was influenced by the education she received from her father, who told her to observe the poorest people and seek ways to improve their lives. According to him, only by doing so could the country become a better place. Chloe has a desire to change people's perception of reality, but when her fiancé is announced at the coming-of-age ceremony, she will no longer be free for the rest of her life. She even thinks about seeking refuge in a temple, but her father would be deeply saddened by that. At that moment, a child appears in front of her and the crowd wonders who that boy is. The child raises a ring and says the princess gave it to him, stating that she asked him to return the ring someday. Chloe recognizes the ring as hers but remembers that she had given it to a poor child. The guards immediately place a sword at the boy's throat, while he insists that it may be hard to believe, but he is the same child from before. He is the only one with dark hair in Felia's, or perhaps the only one in the entire duchy. Chloe is startled as the boy seems so weak and small just a short time ago. The child then uses his mana to summon the lunar wolf in its smaller form. Chloe is delighted by the wolf's cuteness, as only very pure children can summon such a spirit. She also compliments the name he gave the wolf, commenting that she wouldn't have imagined he had grown so much in just 2 months. The boy introduces himself as Tiny and explains that his growth accelerated because he awakened his mana. However, the red-haired girl is suspicious, finding the situation odd. The blonde suggests it would be better to interrogate him after a quarantine, but Tiny says he won't ask for trust. He recalls what the princess told him that day and expresses his desire to meet Lord Asgard von Valencia. The crowd again points swords at him, asking how he dares. Tiny responds that there's no way he could harm the Sword Saint, as there are only 7 superhumans across the entire continent, and one of them is the Sword Emperor, who can wield the power of destruction. Everyone is impressed, praising his excellency's prestige. However, Tiny expresses his wish to personally explain to the Duke what happened in Felia's. Sometime later, Chloe was interrogating her knight to find out if she was hiding anything beyond what Tiny had said. The knight reveals that there was a black mage in the Empire and that it seems there's someone even greater behind it. Since Tiny experienced all of this, his testimony could be an important clue, so it's better to take him to her father soon. Meanwhile, Chloe asks how long the redhead is going to keep holding the wolf. She even tries to get the redhead to pet it, but the girl blushes from the animal's cuteness. Chloe then asks where Tiny is. In truth, the young Edmund had taken Tiny because he wanted to say something. At that moment, the wolf had already disappeared. Meanwhile, Tiny asks the young man what he knows about the black mage. In reality, it was just a trap to get Tiny to follow him, as now he was going to teach Tiny good manners with a slap session. However, on the first slap the young man tried to deliver, Tiny grabbed his hand with one of his own and didn't let go. Tiny only let go after scratching his ear and asked if, by bringing him there, he had prepared something interesting. So Tiny followed the young man. Meanwhile, the red-haired knight rode out on horseback looking for them because, according to the princess, the spirit disappears when the master is getting too far away. Outside the castle, they arrived at a place where the Rufus family lives. The man there was asking if Tiny had come for the product. However, Tiny wasn't interested in any of that. What he wanted was for the strong men to educate that questioning orders. When the other men stepped forward to face Tiny, they realized he was the same boy from earlier. They were terrified and told the boss that this was the boy who had defeated them. The boss grabbed a club and rushed at Tiny, but Tiny pushed him back with a single blow, asking if that was all they had. He was ready to take down everyone there. However, before he could do anything, the men were already passed out from fear. The 2 remaining ones didn't want to fight at all. Sometime later, the redhead arrived and saw that everyone had been defeated, while Tiny sat atop a chest reading. He handed the chest to her, which contained a book of bribes, as those men had been involved in human trafficking. With that, the student stupid blonde wouldn't be able to fool anyone anymore. After that incident, the foolish blonde was expelled from the duchy, and finally, Tiny was ready to meet the Sword Saint. In truth, the young Edmund had taken Tiny because he wanted to say something. In the carriage, Tiny asks if she doesn't distrust him, and in fact, she's already heard of the dark-haired boy from Philias. They say he destroyed the underworld organization and freed all the victims, and he's just done it again. That's incredible, but she still scolds him because he needs to warn her before doing these things. 3 days later, the knights stop and ask the princess why an elf requested to accompany them. She immediately says that she is an envoy of the World Tree Arena, and she came to greet the travelers because she wishes to join them at this moment. The girls are delighted by the elf, while Tiny notices that she is a fifth circle sorceress. These elves are descendants of fairies, famous for their beauty. Elvenheim, the kingdom of the elves, is located at the far west of the map, so it was always very difficult to see elves in the Aslan Empire. Even so, most people are friendly toward them, as elves are born with elemental abilities and are known for being pure, kind, and gentle. However, since this elf is a fifth circle black mage, it's odd. She explains to the princess that she is passing through the duchy on her way to the kingdom of Werevist. The elf formally introduces herself to the group, showing respect and stating that her goal is to travel the world listening to stories. She asks if the princess is the owner of the spirit, but the real owner is the boy right behind, our Tiny, who is suspicious, as he never thought someone like her would be of high rank in the organization. Switching to acting mode, he says, "Wow, it's my first time seeing an elf," while the other girl asks if he's gone crazy, grabbing her leg. Fortunately, this lady doesn't know about the Moon Wolf's abilities, as only the owner can know that. While they were talking, the elf demonstrated magic, and Tiny began analyzing the situation. They have 12 level 3 specialists and a level 4 warrior. Thinking about it, the stages of a mage's circles and a mana user can be seen as equivalent. To defeat someone of a higher level, at least 5 people of 1 level below would be necessary. In other words, if he, who is level 2, wants to beat someone from the 5th circle, he would need at least 100 copies of himself, since with just one attack from her, he'd be done for. Fortunately, they have a secret card and just need to wait for the right opportunity. When the little wolf jumped on the elf, she suggested holding him for a bit. At the first "come here, darling," the wolf transformed into its monstrous form, and Tiny started attacking with his hammer, while their redhead came in with her sword because that elf is a black mage. A few minutes earlier, Tiny had warned the princess, using the Moon Wolf, that this was a dark elf, and that if they didn't launch a surprise attack, they'd be in danger. That's why the wolf jumped on the redhead to deliver the message. Now back to the action, Tiny hammering from one side and the redhead with her sword. When the elf dodged, she ascended into the air with her magic while the knights advanced. Tiny tried a left swing, but it didn't work as she used magic against the group, wondering how these bastards figured her out. Tiny, with his wit, responds mentally. Of course we'd know, her stench can be smelled from miles away. Because of that, a giant spell exploded in Tiny's direction, but he managed to use some kind of shield, so the damage wasn't too severe, although still dangerous. The redhead advanced while Tiny mounted the wolf and kept hammering at the elf's shield. Now the two attacked together to finally break that black elf's shield, and since it dealt a lot of damage, Tiny came down, slamming her into the ground. At that point, the two of them came again while she cast magic at all the knights, aiming at the princess. The redhead managed to defend. Tiny then used his iron armor and came from above, as now it was full force. This caused a massive explosion, and finally it broke the elf's shield. The redhead advanced again, but the elf cast more magic. Even wounded, she still had all that power. With his iron body, Tiny started hammering the woman, who caused a mega explosion, almost as if the asphalt were burning. From above, she began summoning a strange power, and Tiny realized that she was the last and used the offering of flames on the knights, burning them all. Everyone was at their limit, and they needed a greater force to finish off that wretched woman. And so it was Chloe's turn to act. Chloe came in with power of light, Shane. For in this world there is divine power granted through penance and blessings. Those who achieve priesthood through penance upon being baptized learn about divine power and receive anti-demon powers. However, there are people who are born with this power, like a saint or a warrior, who are said to be sent by God, beings who are rarely born. Chloe is one of those rare beings, a cleric, someone who wasn't born into priesthood. The knights were astonished as she had hidden her divine power even from them. According to Tiny, Chloe is the most powerful cleric he has ever seen, and now her power would be enough to wipe out the damned elf. When the elf fell to the ground, Tiny was quick to hammer her head. But when it came time to finish her off and seal her in the coffin, Chloe ran over, saying that she couldn't die as she needed to be interrogated. Chloe still needed to know the reason behind all of this. Even so, it seemed that the last hammer strike was the last thing the elf saw. Chloe thought of healing her with her divine power, while her guards commented on how incredible the princess was. And with that, Chloe's secret was revealed. Chloe asked Tiny if he already knew all of that, since he was the only one who didn't seem surprised. Tiny, a bit awkwardly, explained that he knew but still couldn't reveal the reason. One day, she would certainly find out. To his surprise, Chloe replied with a simple, "Alright, but next time tell me." Tiny then revealed that the black mage was after him because of the trouble he had gotten himself into. For Chloe, it was fine because it was the duty of nobles to eliminate all threats. If she had died, it would have been her own fault for not having enough power. This showed that Chloe was still the same as she was in her past life. She gave him a few pats as he was worried about something silly. Meanwhile, our red-headed lady arrived, commenting that Tiny really hated being called a child. She came over, pulling his cheeks, teasing him because a child really doesn't like being called cute. Then the princess mentioned that she needed to report everything to her father as soon as possible. They continued their journey to Taiban, the main gate. Tiny knew that the princess's father took very good care of her, but he thought that this was a bit much as all the knights of the Blue Wing were there to escort her. These knights are, at the very least, specialists, and they are the most powerful group in the empire. They all kneeled as they presented themselves to the princess, and she commented that they had done an excellent job. Baron stood up, saying he was happy for the princess's safety, as her excellency had been very worried. The princess, however, was certain she had informed them that she was 100% safe, and that there was no need for such a fuss. According to Garin, if there hadn't been an emergency, the Lord would have come personally. The truth is, about a month and a half ago, the Tempest family's relic disappeared, a relic that is always with her father. When Tiny heard that, he immediately asked if the relic was an artifact. Not even Chloe knew, as it's a secret that can only be passed down to the head of the family. Faced with this, Tiny believed he knew the reason behind the relic's disappearance and asked to see his excellency, saying that he would reveal what he knew. Shortly after, Garin asked who that boy was. According to the others, he was incredible, and they said he was the one who had captured a black mage. Moreover, he's almost at the level of an expert. Garin was astonished as not even the 7 great knights had reached that level at such a young age, so he concluded that Tiny was either a genius or, more likely, a monster. Reflecting on this, the big man finally remembered that Tiny was the boy who had brought the letter from Philias. On the way, Chloe was admiring the landscape. Tiny asked if she liked those lilac flowers, and she told him that her father and her late mother had also loved them very much, and that's why she had been given her name. Our redhead also commented that the love between the Duke and the lady was quite famous. While they talked about this, Tiny recalled his mother's last words. In truth, he didn't like that flower, but she had asked him not to forget that detail. Surely, he wanted to keep that a secret. Either way, he knew he needed to find the Sword Emperor to establish his training and figure out Commander he wouldn't be able to help with anything. In this life, Tiny was determined to destroy everyone who stood in his way. Finally, they arrived in Valentino, where the mansion of the Duke of Valencia is located, one of the largest in the empire. Upon arriving, the guards were all joyful, while the princess asked if this was Tiny's first time there. At that moment, a bearded man appeared, shouting, "Chloe, my daughter, are you all right?" And she, embarrassed, replied, stop it. Everyone's watching. This is so embarrassing." After being scolded by his daughter, the man thanked the knights and announced that a banquet was awaiting them. Then he asked who the boy was, and Chloe answered that she had already mentioned him, saying that Tiny was the boy who would talk about the Black Mage. Tiny stepped forward, saying he knew where the Tempest artifact was. The crowd was surprised, murmuring, "Oh boy, he spilled the beans." At that moment, the swordsman called the boy cheeky and exerted pressure on him, but Tiny resisted, despite the pressure from the man's soul. Even so, the Emperor remarked that Tiny still had a lot to learn before reaching his former level. He also mentioned that among the 7 knights, Estina had the highest proficiency, and Jurek could have reached that level. With that, the Emperor dissipated the tension and asked if Tiny was alright to speak about the artifact at that moment. Chloe, for her part, commented that Tiny was just a child and might not know what he was doing. But either way, the Emperor said he needed to have a conversation with him. In the room, the Emperor asked if Tiny knew anything about the disappearance of the Tempest artifact. Tiny confirmed and in his thoughts reflected that Tempest is one of the few ancient words he knew, meaning time or opportunity. If the artifact disappeared a month ago, perhaps his power was to turn back time. Tell me more, boy, the Emperor said, curious. So Tiny began explaining that everything started with a catastrophe that would only occur in 20 years. He detailed the entire story of how he managed to return to the past, explaining everything. The Sword Emperor commented that the story was well crafted, and that Tiny even knew the names of the World Tree's guardians, the first hammer of the dwarves, and the Orc warrior. According to Tiny, they had been his companions for a year, although it was hard to believe even that those two were always at odds. The Emperor then concluded that Depis means time or opportunity, and that only one person can be sent to the past after sacrificing the life of a very powerful human. He also warned that descendants must use this with great caution. These were the words passed down along with the family relic, but honestly, he hadn't thought they were true. However, the circumstances seemed real, even if it was difficult to trust his own judgment. He had relied on someone else's talents and brought someone back to the past. If he had been the one to go back, he would have used his experiences to organize humanity's power and face the Demon King's army. That's why he was astonished that it wasn't him, but Tiny who had returned. Only Tiny in the future knew why. Before he died, he spoke of saving talents. It was then that Tiny realized the man was losing it. The swordsman came to the conclusion that he didn't know exactly when he would return. The only thing he knew was that one must return to the moment when their soul was most disturbed. Seeing this, Tiny must have returned to the moment he found his determination, which is why he went back to the day his sister died. Now the swordsman had 2 more things to check: if his future self had told Tiny to find him, and if he had prepared some form of confirmation. And yes, that was the case, as his daughter's given name was Lilas, chosen because it was his wife's favorite flower. However, the truth was that he didn't really like that flower. He began to laugh because this was something he would have said as a password, and now it finally made sense to him, as only this explained the disappearance appearance of the relic, perhaps because they were in the past, but that old man still had a sense of humor. Even so, he needed to check something else and sent for Night Warrior. He believed in Tiny's regression, but trusting him was another matter. So to prove his abilities, which had been recognized by his future self, he decided to test him. It seems a bit unfair, doesn't it? First, the old man tells him to find him, and now Tiny has to prove his abilities. That's double the work. Then the swordsman asked if Tiny had ever thought about what the future would be like. Tiny started circling around the question, asking if he wanted to know about the future of the duchy. But, in fact, what the man really wanted to know about was the omen of a disaster. He also warned Tiny to never tell people about the future, as humans evolve through their mistakes and failures. The swordsman took pride in having taught his children the right path. With that, Tiny felt relieved as the only omen of a disaster. He also warned Tiny to never tell people about the future, as humans evolve through their mistakes and failures. The swordsman took pride in having taught his children the right path. With that, Tiny felt relieved as he only knew a little about the princess. In the past, Tiny had faced many difficulties and couldn't get close to the aristocracy. The man's eyes widened and he exclaimed, "What?" He had no idea what might happen in the future. The only thing he knew was that the nobility would become a mess. As the man became agitated, Tiny asked what else he wanted to know. Since Tiny was an ally from the future, the least the man needed to know was what the heck had happened because, seriously, what a mess. So it was better for him to remember things correctly before getting beaten to death. That night, Tiny found himself in trouble with the old man because he couldn't remember much of anything. What he knew, aside from what he had personally experienced, were just rumors or stories told by his comrades. The old man, irritated, asked if there was any useful information at all, at least. In the end, the only worthwhile thing was about the warrior and the saint who appeared according to the oracle. The warrior's name was Crombell and he was 20 years old. So the old man said, then I'll train him. The problem was if Crombell was from 20 years in the future. Right now in the past, Crombell hadn't even been born yet. The man became desperate, thinking of blaming his future self. So he asked the butler to bring Drexler instead of Royer, because there was someone present who deserved punishment. Drexler was the vice captain of the Blue Wing Knights, level 5 of the upper rank. The old man stated that the boy needed to be tested to see if he was worthy of his trust. Drexler was shocked because he would have to fight a child. Immediately, thoughts started running through his head. Oh no, I'm going to get fired. How will I support my household without money? The old man scolded him, telling him not to get lost in useless thoughts, as this was a very important matter. When Drexler looked at Tiny, he saw that the boy was probably around 10 years old and already at level 2. Even so, the old man ordered the vice captain to introduce him to the artisan who made the hammer. He quickly gave several tips to improve things. Then the old man hurried, saying that if Tiny didn't perform well, there would be no deal, and he asked Drexler to hold nothing back and fight with full force. In the end, it was decided that if Tiny landed at least one hit, the promise would be fulfilled. They began preparing, and the old man stopped to think that Tiny had a unique way of handling his mana. If it were him, he could also become a specialist far beyond the limit. But still, it was that child who returned, and there must be a reason for that. The battle began. Tiny summoned the Moon Wolf and charged forward. The captain came in with his hammer, but Tiny dodged and managed to land a hit on his shoulder armor. Drexler found it amusing and leaped up, smashing everything around, while Tiny evaded using the wolf, deciding to compete in speed. Drexler then launched a big attack on the ground, destroying the pillars from which Tiny had been jumping, almost hitting him in the face. Tiny concluded that Drexler specialized in defense, which allowed him to predict all his movements. Even so, he dodged everything, literally. Drexler was impressed, but still said it wasn't enough. The old man shouted at Drexler to stop stalling. Drexler then used his soul weapon, leaving even the old man speechless, and ordered him to stop. But Tiny advanced, and there was a huge explosion when their attacks collided. Shortly after, Tiny was sent flying, and both men were concerned about what had happened. The only thing Tiny said was, "I won," since at the height of the attack, he had thrown his mini. It was crazy, as Tiny could have died. But he didn't die, and he won because ever since his past life, that's how he acted. Otherwise, life becomes nothing but a dead end. After all, this is just a game where we need to win at any cost, and that's how he's lived up to now. The Duke agreed, thinking that in Tiny's previous life, he must have believed it was worth trying something reckless. And as promised, the old Duke would keep his word and give Tiny what he needed. The moment Tiny thanked him, he collapsed to the ground and took a nap. When he woke up, he was in a room, and the Duke called him, saying they had a lot to talk about. In a hallway, Chloe appeared, calling the Duke and asking where he was taking the boy who had just woken up, asking if he was going to hurt him again. The Duke responded that Tiny had hurt himself, asking how he could harm his daughter's benefactor. Sure, Chloe replied. Tiny was confused by this benefactor talk, thinking it was the opposite, and apologized to Chloe, saying he was greedy and ended up getting hurt. Chloe, happy, said that Tiny